The marsh ambush, when an army drowned in its own retreat. You know what drowns a soldier? Not water, not the enemy's blade. Fear. Picture this, a young knight, maybe 23 years old, writing a letter to his mother the night before. He talks about coming home, about the farm he'll buy, about the girl waiting for him in the village. That letter never gets sent, because 24 hours later, he's sinking. Not in a glorious battle, not with a sword in his hand, fighting for something he believes in. He's drowning in mud. His armor, the same armor his father wore, passed down through generations, becomes his coffin. He claws at the straps, fingers slipping on wet leather, screaming for help that never comes. Around him, his brothers in arms are doing the same. Grown men, warriors, reduced to animals, desperate, panicking, crying out for their mothers as the earth swallows them whole. This isn't a story about war. This is a story about how pride kills, how nature doesn't care about your victories, your banners, your legacy, and how an entire army, thousands of men who marched out as conquerors, vanished into the ground, leaving nothing behind but silence and the ghosts of their final screams. You're about to witness the marsh ambush, the day geography became a weapon and retreat became a mass grave. Stay with me, because what happened here changed the rules of warfare forever. And those who forget this story disrespect every man who drowned in that mud, reaching for a sky he'd never touch again. 3 weeks earlier, they were invincible. The army had just crushed 2 major enemy strongholds in rapid succession. Fortress walls that had stood for centuries crumbled under their siege engines. Enemy commanders surrendered or fled. Villages along their path offered tribute without a fight. Banners flew high, drums beat in triumph, and the soldiers sang songs of their own greatness as they marched. Their commander, a decorated general with 15 years of victorious campaigns, believed he was writing his name into legend. His heavy cavalry was the finest in the region. His infantry, battle-hardened and disciplined. His supply trains stretched for miles, loaded with plunder and provisions. They weren't just an army. They were a moving fortress of steel and confidence. But wars don't end with victories. They end with getting home alive. The campaign season was ending. Winter was approaching. The general made a decision that seemed logical at the time. Take a shorter route back to friendly territory. Cut through the marshlands instead of the longer, safer mountain pass. Save 2 weeks of travel. Get the men home before the first snow. Local guides warned him. The marsh is treacherous this time of year, they said. Heavy rains have turned the paths into traps. What looks solid can give way in seconds. Wagons will sink. Horses will panic. There are only a few safe routes, and they're narrow, barely wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side. The general dismissed them. He'd just conquered 2 fortresses. He'd defeated armies twice his size. He'd outmaneuvered enemy generals who'd been fighting since before he was born. What was a marsh compared to all that? We march through, he declared. With discipline and speed, we'll cross in 2 days. The enemy is scattered and broken. No one will dare attack us. He was right about one thing. The enemy was broken, but they weren't gone. The first day of the marsh crossing seemed to prove the general right. The vanguard, light infantry and scouts, found the old trade path that cut through the wetlands. It was narrow, yes, and muddy, but passable. They marked the route with stakes and rope. The main army began filing in behind them, a long column of men, horses, and wagons stretching back for miles. The marsh itself was a deceptive landscape. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful, tall reeds swaying in the wind, pools of still water reflecting the gray sky, patches of solid ground covered in moss and wildflowers. But up close, it revealed its true nature. The ground was never quite solid. Every step required testing the earth ahead. Horses became nervous, sensing the instability beneath their hooves. The heavy supply wagons, loaded with armor, weapons, food, and treasure, began to sink into the soft ground, their wheels cutting deep ruts into the mud. By midday, the army was spread out dangerously thin, a miles-long chain of men and equipment struggling. The vanguard was hours ahead of the rear guard. Communication became difficult. Orders took forever to pass down the line. Soldiers who'd been singing that morning were now silent. focused on the exhausting work of pulling wagons free, calming panicked horses, and navigating the treacherous path. The general, riding in the middle of the column with his command staff, began to feel the first whispers of doubt. The crossing was taking longer than expected. The army was vulnerable, stretched out like this. But they were already committed, too deep into the marsh to turn back, and still a day away from the other side. That's when the enemy made their move. They'd been watching, waiting, following the army's progress from the solid ridges that bordered the marsh. They weren't a unified force anymore. The army had shattered them weeks ago. But they were survivors, and survivors are dangerous. They knew this land. They'd grown up here. They knew which paths were real and which were traps. They knew where the marsh was deepest. They knew where the only escape routes were. And they knew exactly when the invading army would be at its most vulnerable. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the wetlands, the enemy struck, not with a frontal assault, but with something far more devastating. They blocked the path ahead and behind. The first most soldiers knew of the ambush was the sound of trees falling. The enemy had cut down massive oaks and pines along the ridgeline and sent them crashing down across the narrow path, ahead of the vanguard and behind the rear guard. In seconds, the army was trapped in a miles-long corridor of mud and water with no way forward and no way back. Then came the arrows. Not a volley aimed at destruction, but strategic shots targeting the horses, the officers, anyone trying to organize a response. Panic began at a dozen points simultaneously. Horses, struck by arrows, reared and thrashed, crashing into men and wagons, pushing soldiers off the narrow path and into the deep mud on either side. And that's when men started sinking. A knight in full-plate armor, knocked off the path by a panicking horse, crashed into what looked like solid ground. It wasn't. The moss-covered surface gave way instantly, and he plunged waist-deep into thick, clinging mud. He tried to pull himself out, but every movement drove him deeper. The armor that had protected him in a dozen battles now became an anchor, pulling him down. He screamed for help. His comrades reached for him, but they couldn't get close enough without risking the same fate. Within minutes, he was gone, pulled under, his final screams cutting off abruptly as the mud covered his face. That scene repeated itself hundreds of times in the span of an hour. Soldiers trying to escape the path found themselves in mud that grabbed at their legs like hands. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. Men threw away their weapons, tore at their armor straps, trying desperately to shed the weight pulling them under. Some succeeded in removing their breastplates only to sink anyway, the mud too deep, their strength already spent. The wagons, those heavy wagons loaded with plunder and supplies, began to sink en masse. Soldiers who'd been walking alongside them suddenly found themselves with nowhere to go. The path ahead blocked, deep mud on both sides, and more men pressing from behind. Fights broke out as men tried to climb over each other to stay on the shrinking patches of solid ground. The general tried to rally his forces to organize a defensive position, but command and control had shattered. His orders couldn't reach the front or rear of the column. Individual units were making desperate decisions on their own. Some tried to fight their way through the blocked path ahead, hacking at the fallen trees while arrows rained down on them. Others attempted to find alternate routes through the marsh, leading dozens of men into the deepest, most dangerous parts where entire groups would vanish in minutes. The enemy didn't need to attack directly. They just needed to maintain pressure, to keep shooting arrows, to keep the army panicking and moving in the wrong directions. Nature was doing the killing for them. As darkness fell, the situation became nightmarish. Men couldn't see the solid ground from the traps. Soldiers calling for help in the darkness would fall silent suddenly, and no one knew if they'd drowned or simply given up hope. The marsh filled with sounds, screams, prayers, the sucking sound of mud claiming another victim, the splash of men throwing themselves into deep water, hoping it would be easier to swim than to fight the mud. It wasn't. The pools of open water were often deeper than they appeared, and armor-weighted men sank like stones. Knights, proud warriors who'd charged into battle 100 times, died crying like children, begging for salvation that never came. Sergeants who'd maintained discipline through the bloodiest sieges lost their minds, wandering off the path into certain death. Young soldiers who joined for glory and adventure spent their final moments trying to remove armor with fingers too numb and panicked to work the straps properly. The proud army that had conquered fortresses drowned in a swamp, defeated by mud and fear and their own desperate attempts to escape. By dawn, it was over. The marsh was silent except for the wind moving through the reeds and the occasional cry of a survivor too weak to move, waiting for death or rescue that would never come. Of the thousands who'd entered the marsh 2 days before, fewer than a quarter made it out. The survivors were broken men, weaponless, armorless, traumatized by what they'd witnessed. Many would never speak of it. Some went mad from the memories. Others spent the rest of their lives with a terror of soft ground, unable to walk on anything but stone without panic rising in their throats. The enemy lost perhaps 50 men, mostly scouts who got too close while harassing the trapped army. It was the most one-sided victory in the region's history, and it required almost no fighting. The marsh had done the work. For weeks afterward, the wetlands gave up the dead slowly. Bodies would surface in the deeper pools, bloated and unrecognizable. Armor would emerge from the mud during dry seasons, rusted and empty, marking the graves of men whose names were never recovered. Local villagers found swords, shields, and coins scattered throughout the area for years. Some of the wagons are still down there, buried under centuries of sediment, laden with treasure that cost thousands of lives. The general's body was never found. Some say he drowned trying to rally his men. Others claim he was among the first to flee and died alone, lost in the maze of false paths and death traps. His name, once spoken with respect, became a cautionary tale, a lesson in hubris and the price of ignoring local knowledge. The enemy forces, scattered and broken just weeks before, reconsolidated. The devastating loss shocked the invading nation into abandoning their territorial ambitions in the region entirely. Fortresses were returned. Treaties were signed. The balance of power shifted overnight, not because of a brilliant military campaign, but because an army trusted its pride over nature's warnings. Military academies would study this disaster for centuries. It taught commanders critical lessons: respect the terrain, listen to local guides, never let your army become strung out in vulnerable positions, and understand that retreat is often more dangerous than attack. The marsh ambush became required study, a perfect example of how geography can be weaponized, how psychological warfare can be more devastating than arrows and swords. But those lessons came too late for the thousands who died there. The young knight who'd written that letter home? His mother waited by the window every day for 2 years, watching the road, hoping. The letter was found in his saddlebag by scavengers, water-damaged and unreadable. She never knew he'd been thinking of her in those final days. The farm he wanted to buy was sold to someone else. The girl who'd waited married another man, but friends said she never smiled the same way again. And the marsh? It kept its secrets. Even today, people say the ground is softer there than it should be, that you can feel it shift under your feet if you walk certain paths. Local children are warned never to play near the old crossing site. On quiet nights, some swear they can hear sounds, screaming, praying, the desperate thrashing of men fighting an enemy they can't strike back against. The earth swallowed an army, and it has never given all of it back. This is what war really looks like sometimes. Not glorious last stands. Not heroic charges that changed the course of history. Just mud. Just fear. Just good men dying badly, far from home, for reasons that stopped mattering the moment the ground gave way beneath their feet. History remembers the great battles, the ones with names that echo through time, where tactics and courage determined outcomes. But the marsh ambush is different. It's a reminder that nature doesn't care about your courage. The earth doesn't recognize your rank. And sometimes, the greatest armies fall not to superior enemies, but to their own arrogance and the unforgiving landscape they chose to ignore. Every soldier who sank into that mud was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's father. They had dreams, farms they wanted to buy, families they wanted to raise, lives they wanted to live after the war was over. None of them got that chance. They drowned in a marsh most people have never heard of, in a battle that barely qualifies as a battle, fighting an enemy they could barely see while the real killer, the mud, the water, the weight of their own armor, pulled them under. We owe them this, to remember, to tell their story, to understand that military disasters don't always come with the drama of a final charge or a burning city. Sometimes they come quietly, in a marsh, where men sink one by one until an entire army has vanished and the world moves on without even noticing. That young knight I told you about at the beginning? He was real. They all were. And they're still down there, beneath the reeds and the water and the centuries of sediment, resting in armor they couldn't escape, reaching forever toward a surface they never reached. The least we can do is make sure they're not forgotten.